Think your modern garden is tough? Vikings were growing food in frozen wastelands 1,000 years ago without a single trip to Home Depot. While we struggle to keep tomatoes alive in perfect conditions, these Norse farmers fed entire settlements through brutal winters using nothing but clever tricks and ancient wisdom. Today we're discovering 21 Viking gardening hacks that could transform your backyard into a food-producing fortress. These aren't just historical curiosities, they're battle-tested techniques that still work today. Get ready to discover why Viking gardens were more productive than most modern farms, and how you can use their secrets to grow more food with less work. The raised mound system, nature's drainage solution. Vikings faced a fundamental problem that would make modern gardeners quit before they started: waterlogged soil that stayed frozen for months. Their solution was brilliant in its simplicity. They built raised growing mounds that drained perfectly and warmed faster than flat ground. These weren't just random piles of dirt. Vikings constructed carefully engineered mounds about 3 feet wide and 18 inches high, running them in long rows across their growing areas. The elevated design allowed excess water to drain away immediately while capturing maximum sunlight to warm the soil. They would often orient these mounds running east to west to maximize sun exposure throughout the day. The construction process involved layering different materials: coarse stones at the bottom for drainage, followed by smaller rocks, then organic matter like composted seaweed and animal manure, topped with the best available soil. This layered approach created perfect growing conditions that modern raised bed enthusiasts spend hundreds of dollars trying to replicate. Modern science confirms what Vikings knew instinctively: raised beds can extend growing seasons by 2 to 3 weeks and prevent the root rot that kills plants in wet conditions. You can build Viking-style mounds in your yard using nothing more than a shovel and some organic matter. It's like giving your plants a penthouse apartment with perfect climate control, except the rent is paid in vegetables. Seaweed fertilizer, the ocean's gift to gardens. Living near coastlines, Vikings discovered that seaweed was better than gold for feeding their crops. They collected massive amounts of kelp and other sea plants during low tides, using them fresh or dried as the ultimate soil amendment. This wasn't just convenient, it was genius-level agricultural innovation. Seaweed contains over 60 trace minerals that land-based fertilizers often lack, including iodine, magnesium, potassium, and calcium. Vikings would layer fresh seaweed directly onto their growing mounds or compost it with other organic matter for several months before application. The salt content actually helped preserve the nutrients, while the decomposing seaweed released a steady stream of minerals throughout the growing season. They developed different application methods depending on the season and crop type. Fresh seaweed was applied in fall and allowed to decompose over winter, creating rich, dark soil by spring. During growing season, they would make seaweed tea by soaking dried kelp in water for several days, then using the liquid as a foliar spray or root drench. Modern research proves that seaweed fertilizer increases crop yields by 20 to 30%, while improving plant resistance to diseases and pests. Even if you live inland, you can buy dried seaweed meal or liquid seaweed fertilizer that delivers the same benefits Vikings discovered centuries ago. Your plants will grow like they're getting a daily vitamin shot from the ocean itself. The sunken garden technique, wind protection that works. Viking settlements faced constant wind that could destroy crops and steal precious warmth from growing plants. Their solution was to dig gardens down instead of building them up, creating natural windbreaks that protected their most valuable crops from harsh northern gales. These sunken gardens were typically 2 to 3 feet below ground level, with carefully constructed earthen walls on the windward sides. The design created a microclimate that was several degrees warmer than surrounding areas while providing complete protection from harsh wind. Vikings often lined these sunken areas with stones to retain even more heat during cold nights and prevent soil erosion. The excavation process was community work, with families taking turns digging and moving soil. The removed earth was used to build the protective walls around the garden perimeter, creating an efficient system that used every bit of displaced soil. Drainage was carefully planned with gravel layers and channels to prevent water from pooling in the depression. The physics are simple but effective. Wind flows over the depression instead of through it, while the earth walls absorb heat during the day and release it slowly at night. It's like having a natural greenhouse that never needs repairs or replacement parts. Modern gardeners in windy areas can use this same technique to create protected growing spaces that extend their seasons and increase their harvests. Companion planting with wild herbs, nature's pest control. Vikings didn't have access to pesticides, so they recruited wild plants as their garden security force. They deliberately encouraged certain native herbs to grow alongside their crops, creating natural pest control systems that worked better than any chemical spray available today. Yarrow was their favorite companion plant because it attracted beneficial insects like ladybugs and parasitic wasps while repelling harmful ones such as aphids and ants. Vikings planted it throughout their gardens like a living fence that never needed maintenance. The strong scent of yarrow also helped mask the smell of vulnerable crops from pest insects. Wild mint served double duty, keeping mice and rats away from stored grain while providing flavoring for food and medicine. Vikings would plant mint around their storage areas and granaries, creating aromatic barriers that rodents refused to cross. The mint also attracted beneficial pollinators during its flowering period. Juniper branches were woven into garden borders because their strong scent deterred larger pests like rabbits and deer. Vikings would harvest juniper boughs and create temporary fencing around young plants, replacing the branches as they dried out and lost their potency. The Vikings basically created an invisible force field around their gardens, using nothing but plants that grew wild in their environment. Modern gardeners can use the same approach by encouraging native herbs that naturally repel pests while attracting beneficial insects. Stone heat batteries, solar power Viking style. Long before anyone heard of solar panels, Vikings were using stones as heat batteries to extend their growing seasons and protect tender plants from frost damage. They strategically placed large rocks throughout their gardens to absorb heat during the day and release it slowly through cold nights. The technique required careful stone selection. Dark-colored rocks like basalt worked best because they absorbed more heat, while smooth stones retained warmth longer than rough ones. Vikings would test different stones by placing their hands on them after sunset to feel which ones stayed warm longest. Vikings would arrange these heat batteries around their most cold-sensitive plants, creating warm microclimates that could prevent frost damage even when surrounding areas froze. They learned to position stones on the south side of plants to maximize heat absorption while providing wind protection. Modern science explains why this worked so well. Stones have high thermal mass, meaning they store large amounts of heat energy and release it gradually. It's like having a wood stove that burns all day and keeps your plants warm all night, except the fuel is free sunlight. You can use this same technique in your garden by placing dark stones near tender plants or along the north side of growing beds. The 3-season succession system. Continuous harvests. Vikings developed a sophisticated planting schedule that kept food coming from their gardens for as long as possible during their short growing season. They divided their crops into 3 categories based on cold tolerance and planted them in carefully timed successions that maximized their harvest window. Early season crops like onions, peas, and hardy greens went into the ground as soon as soil could be worked in spring. These cold-tolerant plants could handle light frosts and actually preferred cooler growing conditions. Mid-season vegetables like carrots, beets, and cabbage followed 2 to 3 weeks later when soil had warmed and frost danger was reduced. Late-season crops like beans and squash were planted when the risk of frost had passed and soil was thoroughly warm. But the genius was in the timing. Vikings planted new rows of fast-growing crops like lettuce, radishes, and spinach every 10 to 14 days to ensure continuous harvests. This succession planting meant they could harvest fresh vegetables from early spring through late fall, maximizing the productivity of their limited growing space. They would often have 3 different ages of the same crop growing simultaneously: young plants just emerging, mature plants ready for harvest, and middle-aged plants filling in between. Modern gardeners can use the same system to triple their harvest by planting lettuce, radishes, and other quick crops in waves throughout the season. It's like having a conveyor belt of fresh food that never stops delivering. Fermented fish fertilizer, liquid gold for plants. Vikings turned their fishing scraps into powerful plant food through controlled fermentation, creating one of the most effective organic fertilizers ever developed. They would bury fish heads, bones, and scraps in sealed containers, allowing them to decompose into a nutrient-rich liquid fertilizer that made their crops explode with growth. The fermentation process was carefully controlled to prevent putrefaction and create beneficial bacterial activity. Vikings would layer fish scraps with seaweed and other organic matter in wooden barrels or clay vessels, then seal them tightly to create anaerobic conditions that promoted proper fermentation. The fermentation process broke down the fish proteins into forms that plants could absorb immediately. This liquid fertilizer was incredibly rich in nitrogen for leafy growth, phosphorus for root development, and trace minerals that promoted vigorous plant growth. Vikings would dilute the fermented fish liquid with water, typically 1 part fish fertilizer to 10 parts water, and apply it directly to plant roots or spray it on leaves. Modern organic gardeners have rediscovered this technique and found it produces results that rival expensive commercial fertilizers. The smell is admittedly challenging, but the results speak for themselves. Plants treated with fermented fish fertilizer often grow 50% faster than untreated ones. It's like giving your garden a protein shake that builds muscle in the form of bigger vegetables. Underground root cellars, year-round food storage. Vikings understood that growing food was only half the battle. Storing it properly was equally important for survival through long, harsh winters. They excavated sophisticated underground storage chambers that maintained perfect conditions for preserving vegetables for months without any spoilage. These root cellars were dug 6 to 8 feet deep to stay below the frost line, with carefully constructed stone walls and wooden roofs covered with thick layers of sod for insulation. The constant underground temperature of 32 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit was perfect for storing root vegetables, cabbages, and other hardy crops through the entire winter. Ventilation was crucial. Vikings installed wooden pipes or stone channels to allow air circulation while preventing freezing. They learned that stagnant air led to spoilage, while too much air circulation caused vegetables to dry out. They also used wooden shelves and bins to organize different vegetables and prevent them from touching each other. Modern homesteaders are rediscovering that properly built root cellars can store vegetables for 6 to 8 months without electricity or any other modern preservation methods. The principles remain the same. Consistent cool temperatures, proper humidity, and good air circulation can preserve fresh food through an entire winter. Ash fertilizer, wood fire nutrients. Every Viking household produced wood ash from their fires, and clever gardeners learned to turn this waste product into valuable plant food that could dramatically improve crop yields. Wood ash contains potassium, calcium, and other minerals that plants need, making it an excellent natural fertilizer when used properly. Vikings would save their ash throughout the winter, storing it in covered containers to prevent nutrients from leaching away in rain or snow. They learned that ash from different types of wood provided different benefits. Hardwood ash was richer in minerals, while softwood ash was better for improving soil structure. They would spread ash on their gardens in early spring, working it into the soil before planting. The alkaline ash helped neutralize acidic soils, while providing slow-release nutrients throughout the growing season. Vikings were particularly careful to use ash from hardwood fires, as it contained higher concentrations of beneficial minerals. The application rate was critical. Too little ash provided minimal benefit, while too much could make soil too alkaline and harm plants. Vikings developed rules of thumb for application rates based on soil type and crop requirements. They learned that root vegetables like potatoes and carrots responded particularly well to ash fertilizer. Modern soil tests confirm that wood ash can significantly improve plant growth, especially for vegetables like tomatoes and peppers that need extra potassium. The key is using it sparingly and testing soil pH to prevent over-application. Living mulch systems, ground cover that feeds. Vikings discovered that certain low-growing plants could serve as living mulch, suppressing weeds while actually improving soil fertility and creating more productive garden systems. They encouraged clover and other nitrogen-fixing plants to grow between their crop rows, creating a living carpet that worked harder than any dead mulch. These living mulch plants prevented soil erosion during heavy rains, retained moisture during dry periods, and added organic matter as their leaves and roots decomposed. The nitrogen-fixing varieties actually pulled nutrients from the air and deposited them in the soil for other plants to use through their root nodules. Vikings essentially created self-fertilizing garden systems that got more productive over time. The living mulch plants would be periodically cut back to prevent competition with main crops, and the cut material would decompose in place, adding organic matter directly to the soil. The technique required careful plant selection. The living mulch had to be aggressive enough to suppress weeds, but not so vigorous that it competed with crops for nutrients and water. White clover was a favorite because it stayed low, fixed nitrogen, and could handle foot traffic when harvesting crops. Wild strawberries served similar functions while providing edible berries as a bonus. Modern permaculture gardeners use similar systems with great success, finding that living mulch can reduce watering needs by 50%, while eliminating most weeding chores. The system creates a more stable ecosystem that supports beneficial insects and improves soil biology over time. Smoke preservation gardens, natural food processing. Vikings built specialized smoking structures near their gardens to preserve vegetables and herbs for winter use, creating an integrated food production and preservation system. These weren't just for meat. They discovered that certain vegetables could be smoke-dried to create concentrated, long-lasting food supplies with enhanced flavors. The smoking structures were typically built downwind from living areas, but close enough to gardens for easy transport of fresh produce. Vikings used hardwoods, like oak and birch, for smoking, as these provided the best flavor and preservation qualities without creating bitter tastes. The smoking process removed moisture while adding preservative compounds from the wood smoke. Vikings would smoke dry onions, garlic, and various herbs, creating concentrated flavoring agents that lasted through winter and could be reconstituted with water when needed. They developed different smoking techniques for different vegetables. Root vegetables were partially cooked before smoking to speed the drying process, while herbs were smoked fresh to preserve their essential oils. The temperature and duration were carefully controlled to achieve proper preservation without overcooking. Modern food preservation enthusiasts are rediscovering that smoke-drying vegetables creates unique flavors while extending storage life significantly. It's like having a dehydrator that runs on wood and adds gourmet flavoring at the same time. Icehouse growing. Cold frame innovation. Vikings developed early versions of cold frames using available materials to extend their growing seasons into winter months, creating protected growing environments that allowed fresh food production even in harsh conditions. They would build low structures using stones and wood, covering them with animal skins or thin sheets of ice that acted like primitive glass. These icehouse gardens could protect cold-hardy vegetables through much of the winter, allowing fresh food production when outdoor temperatures were well below freezing. The structures captured solar heat during the day while providing insulation at night, creating microclimates that were 10 to 20 degrees warmer than outside air. The construction process involved building low stone walls about 18 inches high, then creating slanted wooden frames that could support the covering material. The south-facing side was angled to maximize sun exposure, while the north side provided wind protection. The ice covering was particularly clever. Vikings would pour water over wooden frames during cold weather, creating clear ice sheets that let light through while providing excellent insulation. The ice was surprisingly effective at trapping heat while allowing photosynthesis to continue. Modern gardeners can adapt this technique using plastic sheeting or glass to create season-extending structures that cost almost nothing to build and operate. Terraced hillside gardens, maximizing growing space. Vikings living in mountainous areas developed sophisticated terracing systems that turned steep hillsides into productive growing areas, dramatically increasing their available farmland while preventing soil erosion. These terraces prevented valuable topsoil from washing away while creating multiple microclimates on a single slope. Each terrace level had slightly different growing conditions based on elevation, drainage, and sun exposure. Upper levels were warmer and drier, receiving more direct sunlight and having better drainage. Lower levels stayed cooler and moister, benefiting from water runoff from above. Vikings matched their crops to these conditions with remarkable precision. Heat-loving plants like beans and squash were grown on upper terraces, where they received maximum sun and warmth. Cool season crops like cabbage and root vegetables thrived on lower terraces, where they stayed cooler and had more consistent moisture. The stone retaining walls served multiple purposes beyond just holding soil. They absorbed heat during the day and released it at night, creating warm zones that extended growing seasons. The thermal mass of the stones could prevent frost damage on terraces that would otherwise be too cold for certain crops. Seed saving in permafrost, long-term storage. Vikings developed sophisticated seed-saving techniques that ensured genetic diversity and food security for future generations, creating seed storage systems that could preserve viability for multiple years even in harsh climates. They used natural permafrost conditions to store seeds for multiple years, creating seed banks that could survive crop failures and ensure community survival. The seed selection process began during the growing season, when Vikings would identify their best-performing plants and mark them for seed collection. They looked for plants that showed disease resistance, cold tolerance, and high productivity, traits that would be passed on to future generations. Seeds were carefully dried using controlled methods that removed moisture without damaging viability. Vikings would spread seeds on wooden trays in well-ventilated areas, turning them regularly to ensure even drying. The drying process was critical. Too much moisture led to rot, while overdrying could kill the seeds. Seeds were stored in sealed containers, buried in permanently frozen ground. The constant cold temperatures prevented deterioration while protecting seeds from insects and rodents. Vikings maintained detailed knowledge about which seeds remained viable for how many years under different storage conditions. Modern seed savers can adapt these techniques using freezer storage or other cold preservation methods. It's like having a time capsule that preserves next year's garden in this year's harvest. Windbreak forests. Long-term garden protection. Vikings planted trees strategically around their settlements to create permanent windbreaks that protected their gardens for generations. Understanding that long-term thinking was essential for sustainable food production. These weren't random tree plantings. They were carefully designed forest systems that provided multiple benefits while creating protected growing environments. The windbreak trees reduced wind speed by 50 to 80% for distances up to 10 times their height, creating large protected areas where gardens could thrive. Vikings chose fast-growing species that could also provide timber, fuel, and food, making their windbreaks productive as well as protective. Birch trees were favorites because they grew quickly in northern climates and provided materials for tools, containers, and construction. The bark was waterproof and could be used for roofing, while the wood burned hot and clean. Birch also provided sap that could be tapped for syrup and medicinal uses. The design of windbreak forests considered prevailing wind directions and seasonal variations. Vikings would plant multiple rows of trees at different heights to create layered protection. Tall trees formed the main barrier, while shorter trees and shrubs filled in gaps and provided additional protection. Modern homesteaders can use the same approach, planting trees that will protect their gardens while providing other benefits like firewood, wildlife habitat, and privacy screening. Tidal pool, gardening, salt-tolerant crops. Coastal Vikings learned to grow food in areas affected by salt spray and occasional flooding from high tides, developing specialized techniques for managing salt-tolerant crops that could thrive in conditions that would kill most vegetables. This allowed them to utilize coastal areas that would otherwise be unsuitable for agriculture. Sea beans, salt marsh herbs, and other coastal plants became important food sources that required no freshwater irrigation and actually thrived in salty conditions. Vikings learned to identify and cultivate these naturally salt-tolerant plants, expanding their food options beyond traditional crops. They learned to time their plantings with tidal cycles and seasonal salt exposure patterns, understanding that salt levels varied throughout the year based on storms, tides, and seasonal weather patterns. Spring plantings were timed to take advantage of lower salt levels after winter rains had leached salt from the soil. Vikings developed techniques for managing salt exposure through strategic use of fresh water and organic matter. They would collect rainwater to rinse salt from plant leaves after storms and add organic matter to soil to help buffer salt levels and improve growing conditions. Raised beds were particularly important in tidal areas because they provided drainage and lifted plants above the highest saltwater levels. Vikings would build these beds using stones and organic matter, creating growing areas that could handle occasional saltwater exposure without killing plants. They also learned to use salt-tolerant plants as living barriers that protected more sensitive crops from salt spray. These barrier plants would absorb the worst of the salt exposure, while creating protected microclimates behind them. Communal garden fortresses, shared defense systems. Viking communities often built their gardens inside defensive earthworks that protected both people and food supplies during conflicts, recognizing that food security and community security were inseparable. These garden fortresses combined food production with community defense in ingenious ways that maximized both functions. The earthen walls provided wind protection and created warm microclimates, while serving as defensive barriers against both human enemies and animal pests. The walls were typically 6 to 8 feet high, with steep sides that were difficult to climb, topped with thorny plants or wooden spikes for additional protection. Gardens were laid out in organized patterns that allowed quick access during emergencies, while maximizing food production in limited space. Paths were designed to allow rapid movement for defense, while providing efficient access for daily garden work. The communal nature of these gardens fostered cooperation and shared knowledge among community members. Families would specialize in different crops or techniques, sharing their expertise and ensuring that critical knowledge wasn't lost if individual families were affected by conflict or disease. Modern community gardens can adapt these ideas by creating shared spaces that provide security and protection while fostering cooperation among gardeners. Bog iron fertilizer. Mineral-rich soil amendment. Vikings discovered that bog iron, a natural mineral deposit found in wetlands, made an excellent soil amendment that improved plant growth dramatically by providing essential micronutrients that were often lacking in northern soils. This iron-rich material was like a multivitamin for plants, addressing deficiencies that limited crop productivity. Bog iron formed naturally in marshes and swamps, where iron-rich groundwater met oxygen, creating deposits of iron oxide that could be harvested and processed. Vikings learned to identify the best sources of bog iron and developed techniques for collecting and preparing it for garden use. The collection process involved draining small areas of wetlands to expose the iron deposits, then digging and collecting the mineral-rich material. Vikings would often work together to harvest bog iron, as the process required significant labor and coordination. Bog iron was collected from marshes and swamps, then crushed and mixed into garden soil in carefully measured amounts. The slow-release iron helped prevent plant diseases while promoting healthy green growth and improving overall plant vigor. The application timing was important. Bog iron was typically added to soil in fall or early spring, allowing time for the minerals to integrate with the soil before planting. Vikings learned that different crops responded differently to iron supplementation, with leafy greens showing the most dramatic improvements. Modern gardeners can achieve similar results using iron sulfate or other iron supplements, especially in areas with iron-deficient soils. Seasonal migration gardens following the sun. Some Viking communities practiced a form of seasonal gardening that involved moving their growing operations to follow optimal growing conditions throughout the year, maximizing their use of natural microclimates and extending their effective growing season. They maintained multiple garden sites at different elevations and exposures, each optimized for different seasons and crops. Spring gardens were located in protected south-facing areas that warmed early and were sheltered from cold winds. These sites received maximum sun exposure during the critical early growing season, when every degree of warmth could mean the difference between success and failure. Summer gardens moved to higher elevations with longer daylight hours and cooler temperatures that prevented heat stress in crops. These locations took advantage of the extended daylight of northern summers while providing the cooler conditions that many crops preferred during the hottest months. Fall gardens returned to protected areas that stayed warm longer into the season, often near buildings or in sheltered valleys that retained heat and provided protection from early frosts. These locations allowed harvest seasons to extend well into autumn. The migration system required careful planning and coordination to ensure that tools, seeds, and other resources were available at each location when needed. Vikings developed transportation systems and storage methods that supported this mobile approach to gardening. This migration system maximized the use of natural growing conditions while spreading risk across multiple locations. If one garden site failed due to weather or pests, other locations could still provide food for the community. Fermented vegetable production, probiotics, and preservation. Vikings were masters of fermentation, turning fresh vegetables into preserved foods that provided nutrition and probiotics throughout winter months, creating foods that were actually more nutritious than the original vegetables. Their fermentation techniques created foods that could last for months without refrigeration while supporting digestive health and preventing nutritional deficiencies. Sauerkraut was perhaps their most important fermented food, made by shredding cabbage and packing it with salt in wooden barrels or clay vessels. The salt drew moisture from the cabbage while preventing harmful bacteria from growing, allowing beneficial lactic acid bacteria to ferment the sugars and create the characteristic sour flavor. The fermentation process was carefully controlled through salt concentration, temperature management, and exclusion of air. Vikings learned that different salt levels produced different flavors and preservation qualities, and they adjusted their techniques based on the intended storage time and use. Vikings developed specialized containers and techniques for different types of fermented vegetables. Large wooden barrels were used for bulk production of sauerkraut, while smaller clay vessels were used for specialty ferments and smaller quantities. Temperature control was managed through careful placement of fermentation vessels in areas with stable, cool temperatures. Root cellars and other underground spaces provided ideal conditions for slow, controlled fermentation. Modern research confirms that fermented vegetables provide significant health benefits while offering excellent food preservation without refrigeration. Weather prediction gardens, natural forecasting. Vikings developed sophisticated systems for predicting weather using plant behavior and natural signs, maintaining special observation gardens where they monitored plants that reliably indicated coming weather changes. These biological weather stations were often more accurate than modern forecasts for local conditions and allowed Vikings to time their garden activities for optimal results. Certain flowers closed their petals before rain arrived, responding to changes in atmospheric pressure and humidity that preceded storms. Vikings learned to read these signs and would rush to complete weather-sensitive tasks like harvesting or planting when plants indicated rain was coming. Other plants changed their growth patterns before temperature shifts, with some species drooping their leaves before cold snaps, while others showed increased growth before warm periods. Vikings maintained detailed observations of these patterns and used them to predict when to protect sensitive crops or when to plant heat-loving vegetables. The observation gardens included a variety of plants known for their weather-predicting abilities. Scarlet pimpernel was called poor man's weatherglass because its flowers closed reliably before rain. Morning glories twisted their vines in different directions based on approaching weather patterns. These biological weather prediction systems required years of careful observation to master, but they provided remarkably accurate local forecasts that helped Vikings optimize their garden timing. Modern gardeners can learn to read similar natural signs to improve their timing for garden activities and crop protection measures. These 21 Viking gardening techniques represent more than just historical curiosities. They're proven strategies for growing more food with less effort in challenging conditions. What's remarkable is how accessible these methods remain today. You don't need expensive equipment or perfect weather to use Viking wisdom in your own backyard. Start with one or two techniques that match your growing conditions. Maybe raised mounds for drainage or companion planting for pest control. These Norse farmers fed entire communities using nothing but clever observation and practical innovation. If you have enjoyed raiding the past with us, then go ahead and pillage that like button and subscribe for more interesting journeys into the world of Midgard living.